on April 30. 50 years ago, the flag of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam flew atop Independence Hall, marking the glorious victory of the Spring Offensive and Uprising of 19, as well as the great resistance against the U.S. by the entire nation. From here, South Vietnam was completely liberated, the country united, and the triumphant song of the Vietnamese people was sung on the other side. This was the most criticized conflict in American history. For many, the Vietnam War was nothing more than a foolish act, simply because it was a war they had no chance of winning. As reality proves, the Americans suffered a humiliating defeat on the S-shaped land of Vietnam. So why did the world's #1 professional army lose? Small nation considered much weaker. Before we get to the main content, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon to be one of the first to receive notification as Military Knowledge is uploading the latest videos. Your support will be a great motivation for us to continue improving the quality even better. Let's begin. In reality, the United States sought to intervene in the situation in Vietnam as soon as our people and army began their resistance against French colonialism. However, after failing in their plan to use the French to conquer Indochina, the U.S. decided to directly intervene with a strategy of viewing South Vietnam as a crucial area to combat the spread of communism, while also knowing that the Republic of Vietnam government would never have a chance to win a fair election. Therefore, on August 1954, less than a month after the Geneva Conference ended, U.S. President Ashton House ordered direct aid to pro-Western governments in Indochina. Not long after, on September 8 of that year, the U.S. established the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, and placed Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia under its protection. In 1954, the U.S. and France agreed to counter the growing influence or control of the Viet Minh movement, which supported Ngo Dinh Diem in establishing and maintaining a strong anti-communist nationalist government. From November of 1954, the U.S. began providing direct aid to the Saigon government. According to General Joseph Sins, the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, the U.S. would prioritize strengthening the military forces of South Vietnam, training the South Vietnamese army, and providing 90% of the equipment. However, the U.S. could not have foreseen that the Republic of Vietnam, their brainchild, created to counter the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, would prove to be a government with many specific problems. The Saigon government was criticized by opposition factions as a dictatorial, family-run regime of the Ngo brothers, with Ngo Dinh Diem as president, Ngo as senior advisor and chief architect of all Republic of Vietnam policies, and Ngo Dinh Thuc as archbishop of the Archdiocese of Hue and religious leader. In the south, the Catholic Church was under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Can, who advised and directed political organizations both domestically and internationally. Alongside this, the Diem regime ruthlessly suppressed opposition factions, peace movements, and patriots, especially communists, through a policy of denouncing and eliminating communists as outlined in the October 1950. The guillotine was used throughout the South to carry out this campaign. With this law, the Diem regime brutally terrorized the people, killing revolutionary cadres and soldiers, and causing serious damage to resistance bases. Furthermore, Ngo Dinh failed to improve the lives of the people, especially in impoverished rural areas. Corruption was a major problem for the Saigon government, creating a weak leadership and rendering aid from Washington. In effect, therefore, when the U.S. reduced economic aid to the Republic of Vietnam, it immediately fell into a food crisis. Weapons were sold on the black market, and public resentment towards the regime grew. While the fighting spirit of the people diminished, the soldiers were more demoralized than ever. However, that wasn't Diem's biggest mistake. Above, the straw that broke the camels back was his government's suppression of religion for those who didn't know it. Ngo Dinh, his brothers were devout Catholics. Therefore, the government led by the Ngo brothers did not hesitate to implement discriminatory policies against other religion, culminating in 1963 when Diem's government suppressed the Buddhist movement, plunging South Vietnamese society into unprecedented instability. Meanwhile, the Liberation Army was gaining momentum and launching attacks on all fronts. In this situation, some Republican generals, backed by Washington, staged a coup, killing the Diem new brothers and then sentencing Ngo Dinh to death. Thus, it can be seen that the Republic of Vietnam under Ngo Dinh was a corrupt and deplorable government, so bad that even its founder could not tolerate it and had to betray his own ally. However, after Diem's death, the situation improved. The South Vietnamese government remained stagnant and chaotic until 1967 when General Nguyen Van Thieu seized power and established the Second Republic. Things temporarily calmed down, but after the Paris Agreement was signed on April 27, Saigon lost all U.S. support, which the government could not have survived without. As a matter of course, the South Vietnamese armed forces quickly succumbed to the South Vietnamese Liberation Army. 1970, just over a week before the collapse of the Saigon government, Nguyen Van Thieu resigned. Yet he defiantly declared, even without a president, I still have Lieutenant General Nguyen Van Thieu, my compatriot. I am a soldier. Nguyen Thieu pledged to fight alongside my fellow soldiers. However, just a few days later, he secretly fled to Taiwan. From then on, this event is often jokingly referred to as April Fool's Day, a lie by Thieu, and is always used to mock his actions. The cowardice of the South Vietnamese leadership was evident above, and it was difficult to imagine anything better below. Not only those in supreme power, but also lower-ranking officials in the leadership and military command of the Saigon government proved to be masters of. For example, in March 1970, the commander of the 1st Corps and 1st Military Region, Ngo Quang Truong, boldly declared, like a hero, that the Viet Cong would have to step over his dead body to enter Hue. However, the very next day, the general cowardly. About a month later, General Min Dao, commander of the 18th, followed his colleague's example by declaring he would fight to the death at Xuan Loc, with the determination to see things through to the end. General Dao fled to Saigon after the Xuan Loc defense line was breached by the Liberation Army. Vice President Nguyen Sao Kai had evacuated by helicopter, leaving behind his promise to transform Saigon into a second styling group alongside the Allies. All were better at talking than doing. The Americans also faced considerable difficulties due to their incompetence, coming from within themselves. Just about 3 weeks after the execution of the Ngo Dinh brothers, followed by the assassination of U.S. President Kennedy and the rise of Johnson to power, the war in Vietnam began to show signs of deterioration for the United States. The Liberation Army was continuously winning battles. The Saigon government was still mired in instability, and the international community was still scratching their heads wondering what the Americans were doing in Vietnam. However, it is important to remember that at this stage in U.S. history, the domino theory was a very influential political theory. This idea suggested that if a country fell into the hands of communism, a red tide would soon spread to other countries. In this case, the Americans believed that if the Vietnamese communist forces won, sooner or later the communist flag would fly over government buildings in Thailand, India, and the Philippines. Therefore, upon becoming the White House, Johnson decided to take stronger action instead of just sending weapons and money to the Saigon government as his predecessor had done on the destroyer U.S. mess. While in the Gulf of Tonkin, encountered 3 North Vietnamese warships, but suffered no damage. The following night, under harsh and turbulent conditions, the USS Madison, USS Turney received signals indicating an attack by the People's Navy of Vietnam, forcing them to open fire and call for air support. Later reports from Pentagon files revealed that there was actually no attack from the north. It was all due to a jammed reconnaissance system, causing false alarm. However, the Johnson administration deliberately distorted this obvious truth, lying to Congress and the American people to justify war. On August 0, 1960, the Capitol passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing the Johnson administration to use military force in Vietnam. From this point, the United States officially entered the war on March 0, 19. The first American troops set foot in Vietnam, and at its peak, up to 500,000 U.S. soldiers were present in the South, both training and directly fighting against the liberation forces. However, it did not take long for them to realize that their war plan was fundamentally flawed. First, the U.S. military was powerless to prevent the North from supplying the South via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It must be emphasized that in war, logistics plays an extremely important role, if not decisive factor between victory and defeat. Many great military strategists have stressed this repeatedly throughout history with sayings like, children talk tactics, adults talk logistics. Of course, the leadership of the world's most powerful professional army understood this and clearly recognized what they needed to do to cut off this strategic logistical supply line. However, despite hundreds of tons of napalm and herbicides being dropped on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it remained intact and continued to transport supplies. Hundreds of tons of goods per day, along with army units and supplies for the South, later failed. The failure of these campaigns was explained by the difficult terrain, making it impossible to accurately bomb targets hidden under dense foliage. Even if they hit, the Vietnamese troops would simply divert the bombs, and transport operations would continue as if nothing had happened. And when all napalm bombs and defoliants proved ineffective against what was hailed as one of the greatest military architectural achievements of the 20th century, the Americans decided to use weather weapons. In 1967, the U.S. Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency (CI) launched a top-secret operation called Popeye, aiming to prolong the rainy season as long as possible in selected areas to weaken the surface structure of the land, turning it into muddy swamps, causing erosion and landslides for 5 years, from March 20, 1967, to July 1972. Weather Reconnaissance Unit 54 conducted a total of 600 missions, using 1,000 units of chemicals and spending approximately 18 million in taxpayer money. However, before achieving the expected results, Operation Pi forced to end when information about it was leaked in the press. For more details, viewers can refer to the video we have linked below. Furthermore, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not the only strategic supply route. Alongside it, we also have the legend of the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the sea, created unmarked ships for 14 consecutive years, from 1961 until the day of the complete victory. These unmarked ships transported hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons and goods to distant battlefields, where the strategic land transport route could, delivering a quantity of weapons even greater than that delivered by land during the same period. This was a brilliant mission and a significant contribution to the historic victory. April 30, 19, marked the complete liberation of South Vietnam and the reunification of the country. Not only did this fail to halt the supply lines from the north,